The old oak tree in front of my house used to be a symbol of peace. Its branches, wide and gnarled, had shaded generations of families in Willow Creek estates. When I retired from investigative journalism, that tree and the quiet suburban life it represented was exactly what I craved. No more deadlines, no more digging for truth in dusty archives or hostile boardrooms. Just me, my books, and the occasional visit from my brother, Mark, the county sheriff. Then came Beatrice Maxwell. B, as she insisted on being called, arrived like a carefully coiffed tornado, sweeping into the vacant HOA presidency with an agenda as rigid as her suspiciously immobile blonde hair. Before B, Willow Creek had been a haven of amiable neglect. The HOA existed, sure, but mostly to ensure the community pool didn't turn green and that nobody painted their house in a shade that offended the local wildlife. B changed all that. Overnight, the monthly newsletter, once a bland bulletin of bake sales and lost cats, became the bylaw bulletin. A chilling catalog of infractions and threats. My porch light, a perfectly functional fixture that had illuminated countless evenings, was suddenly non-compliant to many lumens, apparently according to a newly discovered, meticulously cited Section 3.2.b of the HOA covenants. My welcome mat, a cheerful depiction of a Labrador Retriever, was deemed unapproved color palette. Section 5.1.d. Even the coil of my garden hose by the spigot drew a formal warning, referencing the obscure Section 7.8.a, regarding aesthetic coherence of outdoor utilities. At first, I chuckled. This was small-town tyranny, a far cry from the international conspiracies I used to unravel. But the fines started coming. Small, irritating sums that quickly escalated. More concerning was the chill that settled over Willow Creek. Neighbors, once quick with a wave and a chat, now hurried past, eyes downcast. B had her compliance committee, a trio of overly eager busybodies who patrolled the streets with clipboards and smug expressions, reporting every minor transgression. One afternoon, B herself knocked on my door, a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. "Mr. Peterson," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we've noticed your new deadbolt. It's a clear violation of structural alteration guidelines, Section 4.2.b. I'd replaced an old flimsy lock with something more secure." As she spoke, Mark, who was visiting that week, stepped out onto my back patio with his coffee. He gave me a slow, knowing wink. B froze, her carefully constructed composure cracking. The self-declared Queen of Willow Creek had just encountered a genuine, badge-carrying authority figure. Mark simply nodded. "Nice lock, Alex. Looks pretty secure." B mumbled something about misunderstanding and retreated, her flip-flops slapping a less angry rhythm as she hurried away. That incident was a brief reprieve, but it didn't deter B. Her focus simply shifted. The fines continued, now accompanied by thinly veiled threats about property liens. She even sent a notice about water conservation measures which seemed to specifically target my usage, implying she might temporarily suspend my water service for excessive landscaping, even though I barely watered anything beyond a few hardy shrubs. It was ridiculous, but the underlying malice was undeniable. My journalistic instincts, dormant for so long, began to stir. This wasn't just petty power. This felt different. I started keeping a meticulous ledger. Dates, times, specific violations, photos, and copies of every one of B's bylaw bulletins. I talked to my neighbors, gently at first, then more pointedly. Mrs. Chen, next door, usually so stoic, confessed she'd been fined for the excessive vibrancy of her petunias. Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant, grumbled about inexplicable spikes in HOA maintenance fees, particularly for contractors he'd never seen around. Then came the really concerning development. B started pushing for community improvement projects that seemed exorbitant and, more importantly, lacked any form of transparent bidding or community vote. A new decorative archway at the entrance, costing 3 times what a similar structure should, was the first red flag. Then came the upgrade to the clubhouse. Suddenly, the modest community center was undergoing a lavish renovation. Marble tiles, custom-built cabinetry, and a state-of-the-art sound system, none of which seemed to serve any practical purpose for a lending library and meeting space. And every single contract, it turned out, went to companies with tenuous, often untraceable, links to B's distant relatives. I shared my suspicions with Mark. He listened patiently, sipping his coffee, his eyes sharp. "Sounds like classic grifter behavior, Alex," he said. "Petty tyranny to establish control. Then the real game begins. The money. Start looking at the financials, those contracts. Connect the dots. Get everything documented. And I mean everything." So, I began my quiet investigation. I requested HOA financial statements, only to be met with obfuscation and delay. I cross-referenced property records, business registrations, and public contractor licenses. It was tedious work, but the patterns began to emerge. Shell companies, inflated invoices, and payments routed to P.O. boxes linked to dummy corporations. The small percentage Linda Beckley and that other HOA story took seemed like pocket change compared to what B was siphoning off. This wasn't just overreach, it was outright embezzlement. The community, however, remained largely paralyzed by fear. Many residents were older, on fixed incomes, and terrified of B's threats of liens and legal action. They saw her as an unstoppable force, a hurricane in a pastel pantsuit. I knew I needed something to break that spell, a moment that would expose B for what she was. Not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood. That moment came on a Tuesday. Mark was visiting again, enjoying a rare few days off. It was just before dawn, still dark, when a loud, insistent pounding erupted from my front door. I looked at the clock, 4:30 a.m. Who in their right mind? I glanced at Mark, who was already awake, grabbing his service weapon from his nightstand, out of habit, though he usually left it locked away when visiting. The pounding intensified, accompanied by an imperious voice. "Mr. Peterson, this is Beatrice Maxwell. We are conducting a surprise compliance inspection. Your unauthorized renovations necessitate immediate access." Unauthorized renovations. I hadn't so much as changed a light bulb in months, other than the non-compliant one. This was a pretext. This was B, finally going for broke, trying to intimidate me into submission. I looked at Mark. He raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Surprise inspection, huh?" he mouthed. He quickly pulled on a t-shirt and jeans. "Let me handle this." I opened the door to reveal B, flanked by her 3 compliance committee thugs. 2 hulking men who looked like retired bouncers and a nervous woman clutching a clipboard. B wore a triumphant, almost manic grin. "Well, Mr. Peterson," she began, stepping forward, "as per Section 12.3.d of the bylaws regarding urgent compliance matters, we require immediate access to inspect the interior of your premises. 4. "Hold on right there." Mark's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence. He stepped out from behind me, casual but radiating an undeniable authority. B's eyes, wide with self-importance, landed on him. "And who," she sneered, "might you be?" "This is private HOA business." Mark slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, and held it up, catching the faint light from the street lamp. "County Sheriff Mark Peterson," he stated, his voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of amusement. "And you, Ms. Maxwell, are attempting to unlawfully enter a private residence without a warrant, probable cause, or even a hint of legal authority. That's called breaking and entering. And these gentlemen," he gestured to her 2 enforcers, "are accessories to a felony." B's face, already flushed with indignation, drained of all color. Her mouth worked, but no sound came out. The 2 bouncers looked at each other, then nervously at their shoes. The woman with the clipboard dropped it with a clatter. "I suggest," Mark continued, his voice hardening slightly, "that you and your committee turn around go home and rethink your definition of HOA authority, because right now you're looking at arrest. B stammered, but the bylaws ... section. There's no bylaw in the world, Mark interjected, that supersedes the law. And the law says you don't get to kick in people's doors because their garden hose isn't coiled to your liking, or because you think they're renovating without your permission, or whatever fabricated excuse you've cooked up to justify your little pre-dawn raid. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or am I going to have to make a few phone calls to the DA's office and Financial Crimes Division right now? The mention of the DA and financial crimes hit home. B's face contorted, a mixture of rage and terror. Without another word, she whirled around and stormed off, her 3 terrified cronies scrambling to follow. Their rapid retreat was almost comical in the pre-dawn gloom. The next morning, the story of the pre-dawn raid spread like wildfire through Willow Creek Estates. Neighbors, no longer paralyzed by fear, began to stir. Calls started coming into my house and to Mark's office. People shared their own stories of B's harassment, the exorbitant fines, the suspicious community improvements. The dam had broken. Armed with my meticulous documentation and the sudden flood of additional complaints, Mark wasted no time. He contacted the district attorney's office and the Financial Crimes Division. They were very interested, especially when presented with the evidence of inflated contracts, shell companies, and the clear pattern of embezzlement. My background as an investigative journalist proved invaluable. I knew exactly what information they needed and how to present it. The legal process, as always, was slow but relentless. B tried to fight back, of course, filing ridiculous countersuits, but without merit, they were quickly dismissed. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The Financial Crimes Division launched a full-scale investigation, auditing years of HOA records. What they found was even worse than I had suspected. B had been systematically siphoning off funds, using her position to enrich herself and her cronies through fraudulent contracts and hidden fees. Eventually, facing undeniable proof and the threat of severe prison time, Beatrice Maxwell entered into a plea deal. She was forced to resign from the HOA board, pay hefty fines, and was sentenced to a lengthy period of probation. The money she embezzled was, thankfully, largely recovered and returned to the community fund. Willow Creek Estates finally began to heal. Oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. The Compliance Committee disbanded, and the bylaw bulletin reverted to a friendly community newsletter. People started planting what they liked in their flower beds. Garden hoses were coiled with casual imperfection, and porch lights met their owner's own ambient luminescent standards. Mark still visits for coffee, and we often laugh about the great pre-dawn raid. He always says it was the most satisfying arrest he never officially made. The biggest lesson from all this: power, even the seemingly insignificant power of an HOA presidency, can corrupt if left unchecked. But when ordinary people, armed with facts, determination, and perhaps a conveniently visiting sheriff brother, decide to stand up, even the most entrenched suburban tyrant can be toppled. Never underestimate a quiet retiree with a knack for investigation and a very good reason to fight back.